Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, I'm really happy and honored to have this opportunity to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Chritian Welzel from Leuphana Universität Lüneburg in Germany. Professor Welzel received his doctorate of distinction from the University of Potsdam in 1996. And has been working in various German universities, first in Berlin and later on in Bremen and Potsdam ever since. In 2010, he was appointed as full professor of political culture research at Leuphana Universität. And also in the same year, he became a chief research fellow at the Higher School of Economics in Russia. In 2016, Professor Welzel was elected at Leopoldina, the German National Academy of Sciences, in recognition of his outstanding scientific achievements. So Professor Welzel is widely known for many of his works and great achievements, but perhaps most notably for his long-term involvement in the World Values Survey, which is the largest non-commercial, cross-national, time-series investigation of human beliefs and values ever executed. The survey, as you all know quite well, dates back to 1981 and includes more than 400,000 respondents from at least from 100 countries. Professor Welzel serves as the second vice president of the World Values Survey Association. And yes, he's indeed one of the authors of the famous Inglehart-Welzel cultural map of the world, which importance and usage has long moved beyond the academic circles. Professor Welzel's first notable book, in my opinion, that's one, which is Modernization, Cultural Change and Democracy, which was co-authored with another really well-known political scientist, Professor Ronald Inglehart, was published in 2005. And as of this morning, it has been cited for more than 4,700 times. So the book has made a major contribution to our understanding of social and political change, and has been named as a landmark in the study of political culture and democratization, a tour de force and a crowning achievement of 3 decades of research on the origins, evolution, and consequences of human values. Building on Professor Welzel's earlier work, the book presented a unified theory of modernization, cultural value change, and democratization. According to Professors Welzel and Inglehart, these are all components of a single underlying process, human development, which is seen as the expansion of human autonomy and choice. So one of the two major dimensions of cross-cultural variation which emerged from the analysis of the World Values Survey data, survival versus self-expressive values, taps a similar underlying construct as Hofstadter's individualism, collectivism, and Shalom Schwartz's autonomy, embeddedness, value dimensions, which need, of course, no introduction to this audience. The common dimension underlying individualism, collectivism, autonomy, embeddedness, and self-expression survival reflects an emphasis on autonomous human choice. And the latter is primarily being shaped by a society's level of socioeconomic development. In more recent years, Professor Welzel has focused largely on a specific subset of self-expressive values, emancipative values, that emphasize freedom of choice and equality of opportunities. And this is exactly what he's been discussing in his latest book, Freedom Rising, which was published in 2013. And in this book, he presented an all-embracing theory of emancipation. And this is basically what is his topic, what is the topic of his keynote speech today. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames and messieurs, pani i panowie, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Welzel.
Thank you, Anu, for that extremely flattering introduction, which has a problem because it raises the bar pretty high. So my job today is to keep you from lunch. When I hear the first stomachs growling, I will probably start to stop. Anyways, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming over in such large numbers. It's really a pleasure, especially for a political scientist, to speak in front of a very distinguished audience of psychologists. The title of my talk is The Theory of Emancipation Towards a Psychological Explanation of Societal Progress. Indeed, as Anu already indicated, much of what I'm talking about today is related to my most recent monograph, Freedom Rising. And the core model is depicted already here. So emancipation, I define this as human empowerment. And that is, from my point of view, a three-charted horse consisting of the capability, that's number one, the motivation, that's number two, and the permission, that's number three, for people to pursue a purpose of their choice. And I keep it at that general level as concerns the definition. As I said before, this package of human empowerment has three components. The most basic components, where I believe everything starts from, is this here. I call it the hardware of the entire human empowerment package, because here it's about resources. And I'm talking about resources in a rather broad sense. Of course, it involves material resources like income, technologies, equipment, tools, whatever it might be. But it also includes very prominently intellectual resources. So this is about our skills, human capital, if you like to call it like this. And then third, connective resources, which touches upon social capital and the things that make it easier for us to connect to other people and touch base with like-minded others, which is very important for society's collective action capacity. So three types of resources that are summarized under the term action resources. I call this action resources because when people have more of this, the radius, the scope of activities they can pursue at will is expanding. So these are important for people's action capabilities. The third part here should also be straightforwardly be understood. This is about institutions. So what people are allowed to do in a country by means of a constitution and all kinds of laws that might exist that specify or do not specify individual and human rights. So this is about the number of entitlements that people might have in a society. Political scientists would broadly refer to this as democracy. So that should be quite easy to understand why this is an important part of human empowerment package. But I'm focusing more, and that makes it a psychological theory. I'm focusing the centerpiece of the three packages is this here. And this is a particular set of orientations which I call emancipative values, which are taken from the World Values Survey. So that's one reason why this is a psychological theory, because a set of orientations stays center stage. Another reason why this is a psychological theory is because I believe that the dynamic that generates progress in this model is an automatism in the human mindset. So these emancipative values occur under certain circumstances, we'll talk about this, without any actor having a program or a campaign running to have this happen. So no one needs to have a master plan for that. This is not because elites make a discourse and then instill into people's mindset something that they think is right. This is happening when certain processes start by a force of nature. That's a psychological mechanism. Political scientists don't like to hear that because they think actors is everything that matters and that everything happens through political programs. I'm arguing a little bit different here. So there are two causal hypotheses involved here as concerns these three components. And the basic one is that causality, in my thinking, runs from left to right. So we need to have action resources first so that people recognize they have agency. So they recognize freedoms actually have utility for their life course, and then they will start to value them accordingly. In other words, I'm arguing that subjective values are in touch with objective realities, and that actually allows evolution of moral systems. If it would not be the case, moral systems would be frozen for wherever they are at a given moment. But that, I think, is not the case. And the second causal fact is that I think democratic institutions, human rights, rule of law, or more broadly speaking, high-quality institutions need a cultural context to flourish. It's not sufficient to have some elite actors who are enlightened and have some smart program to make them work, and therefore I believe that emancipative values are a great driver of processes of democratization, and also explain democratic backsliding. For instance, Anu mentioned the book I did with Engelhardt. We had a bivariate scattergram there, where we had self-expression values on the horizontal axis, so societies were more to the right, were stronger in self-expression values, and on the vertical axis we had a measure of democracy from Freedom House, so the higher up the countries were, the more democratic they were. And that was a nice fit, but there were a couple of distinct outliers, including Russia, Hungary, and Romania at that point in time. So they were at this point in time overachievers. They're now regressing back to the regression line, unfortunately. So, but this is what I mean. Countries that have democratized but have not developed that cultural context are more in danger of democratic backsliding, which is now a big issue in political science. Well, briefly to the measure, I'm not going too much here in issues of measurement equivalence, because there is 2 articles about that centering on emancipative values in comparative political studies, where some people criticized our measure for being inequivalent across countries. We responded to that. If you are interested in that, you can read this there. I'm not going too much into detail here. The basic idea, however, is this is not measured as a latent construct. This is a formative additive index. It's simply the added scores over standardized 12 items in total. And I grouped those 12 items into 4 sub-indices. You can also work separately with these sub-indices or combine them in different ways as you like. That's all possible. But the 4 components include reproductive choice. So this is about tolerance, homosexuality, abortion, divorce. 3 items here. Gender equality, women's equality in politics, in the job market, in education. Democratic voice, these are actually classical post-materialism items, and child autonomy. And those 4 components I combine in an overall measure of emancipative values, and then I calculate arithmetic population means for the different countries in the world in order to measure that. Now, is it indeed the case that we see these links? Are action resources linked to emancipative values? The answer is pretty simple, yes. So these are action resources. This is a combined measure. It's close to the Human Development Index, but a little bit broader in terms of the number of indicators that it covers. It's covering life expectancy, it's covering per capita GDP, it's covering schooling years, but it's also covering inverse fertility rates and the Gini coefficient and a couple of other measures of education. And the tendency is quite clear. It's actually curvilinear, exponential growth. As societies tend to have more action resources, emancipative values tend to be higher. There's a couple of outliers. Ethiopia doesn't have a good sample, so university-educated people are heavily oversampled here. That might explain this role. Then we have Qatar and Singapore a little bit more to the right. If we would take into account the structure of the economy, recognizing that these countries have revenues that are not from general income taxation, but either from exporting oil or from having the biggest port in the world, then we might explain these outliers away. But the point here is there is quite a strong relationship. The other relationship that also is existing is from emancipative values on civic entitlements. So this is from the World Values Survey. This is a measure of a new project in political science that many people are now very, very excited about, because we all got a little bit tired with Polity and Freedom House, because they do not show nuanced differences in the quality of democracy, for instance, between Sweden and the United States. But VDEM is the new project that sits in Gothenburg University. VDEM, for Varieties of Democracy, is a big network of 150 people around the world who have started to produce more fine-tuned measures of democracy. And the nice thing about this project is they take democracy from the different conceptual angles that you might have. They have a very narrow concept, which is electoral democracy. They have a very expanded one, which is participatory democracy, and their most extensive one is egalitarian democracy. And this is their measure of egalitarian democracy. And they have that for every country, for every year. All of these measures, you can also disaggregate them to the single indicators as much as you like, for every year from 1900 to 215. And they are now extending these data series into the 19th century. So, many of you might say, all right, anyone can produce scattergrams with a nice cross-sectional correlation, but what about temporality? If there is really a relationship between these variables, we should see that they co-evolve over time, and the cross-section is simply not showing us that. Temporality is, of course, also important to model causality, what came first, what came after, and stuff like this. But there is a problem with the world value surveys and basically with the survey data. How many data points do we have? Even the World Value Survey, which has done 6 waves by now and is currently running the 7th wave. So for each country, we'll just have 7 points of observation with many, many, many missing values in between. Whereas other data, the economic data that I have and the democracy data that I have, are here on a country-by-year basis, all the way back to 1900. So you can create what political scientists, economists are doing, or in econometrics, you create a time-pooled cross-sectional data matrix where the unit of observation is country years. That gives you a large number of observations, but we could only fill a couple of those with emancipative values, whereas democracy data and economic data would be available all over the data matrix. So one way to go about this, which some methodologists might recommend, is to do multiple imputation and fill all the holes by a multiple imputation procedure. But then I would take into account knowledge from other variables than emancipative values themselves to, so to speak, project into these data. And this is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to take advantage of the knowledge that we have about emancipative values and their change rhythms in time and the cohort pattern, and just estimate the missing holes just from the knowledge we have about emancipative values. This is kind of a crazy thing to do, but I did it anyways, and to see whether this creates a meaningful pattern. So what I did, I looked back to this here, where we have a cohort pattern in 1980 and a cohort pattern in 2005. Looks kind of similar. Younger people, younger birth cohorts tend to be more emancipatory than older ones, although it seems it's flattening out over more recent generations. But there is a second factor. There is a trend factor. So the same cohort, as it ages, also gets more emancipatory over time. So there's 2 moments of dynamic here. Cohort replacement and temporal trend. So couldn't we use that information to calculate from a known score in a given year where the score of that country would have been 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, making these assumptions? And this is what I did. So I created a formula where I first took a person's current score on the Emancipative Values Index. Then I calculated for Western countries, the time trend was such that within 10 years, the average Western country would move 0.1. So the scale goes from 0 to 1.0. That's the maximum range. So a country would move in 10 years by 0.1 upward regularly in that scale. That means for each year, it's a 0.01 that I have. Now I can calculate the values that a person had when this person was 15, so in its formative age, by the passage of years back then that it needed, and then multiplying this by the 0.01, and I have the strand factor. But then there is a third thing I have to consider. I give this strand factor full weight only in countries that are pretty high today in emancipative values, because that means these countries have been moving. And that means in the past, they have been lowered down. When a country is very low, like many MENA region countries, I don't make that subtraction because I weighted with the current level and you get a much, much lower subtraction. This, again, also is assuming that apparently countries were more similar in the past in terms of emancipative values than they were today. And actually that makes sense because we know that some of the items, for instance, if you think of gay rights and homosexuality, these are recent issues. Even in the most advanced Western countries, 25, 30 years back, we were conservative on these matters. Yeah. So these are assumptions. You can, of course, debate them. I believe, however, they are defensible. And let's see what happens when we use these assumptions. This is my trend line for emancipative values. All is about for 100 countries, action resources for 100 countries, civic entitlements for 100 countries in the world, and I have used population weights. So China has more impact on this trend than Vietnam, India more than Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. And I was really, really stunned to see this, because I did not involve any knowledge from the other two measures in order to estimate my emancipative values, and you get this pattern, and it really, really looks like there is a co-evolutionary trend between these three components also over time. So we do not only have a relationship in a cross-section, longitudinally considered, there is one too. Now you can make breakups for different regions or culture zones in the world, which I do here, and you could see where the pattern differs. And there is one interesting commonality when you look at the three lines. Action resources and emancipative values would always be close with each other, no matter where you look at, no matter what world region you look at. What can happen is that civic entitlements lose touch base with the other two, but only for a certain amount of time. It only happens for a certain amount of time. Communism, for instance, covers that to a certain extent. So according to my estimations, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and these kinds of countries were too little democratic during communism compared to where the level of emancipative values was during this period. Now, a little bit probing into causality. Which of these components is driving which one in this co-evolutionary dynamic? So I looked first emancipative values as a dependent variable. We are all influenced, at least in my branch of research, by Inglehart's ideas about socialization and the formative phase of socialization and when that happens. If you think that way, you would assume that action resources in a country 30 years back in time, so let's say a generation, would have a stronger impact on a person's emancipative values than action resources right now. And this is what I see. This is, these are two partial regression plots from a multiple regression where I regress emancipative values simultaneously on the current action resources in a country and the action resources that the country had 30 years back in time. And if I do this, it is clear that the resources 30 years back in time have a stronger impact than those ones which actually turn out to be insignificant. Another issue relates to, and that's a big debate with my colleagues in political science, the relationship between emancipative values and democracy. My colleagues argue all the time that I get the causal error wrong, and that emancipative values emerge because democracy is in place, and not the other way around. Well, I don't think it's right, because what I did here, I regress emancipative values on action resources 30 years ago and civic entitlements, which can also be a formative experience. Democracy when you grow up 30 years ago, and this is insignificant, and this is still very significant. So it seems to be, when we make this temporal ordering, that The values are much more reaction to action resources than they are to civic entitlements, which actually allows for the possibility that pressures to democratize can emerge in a society that is not democratic. My pol sci colleagues, when they argue emancipative values are the outcome of democracy, you could never get them if democracy isn't in place. But if you just compare China and India, India has 40, 50 years of democracy. China so far has 0. China has somewhat higher emancipative values than India, and that is in line with China having more action resources, the average Chinese, I mean, than the average Indian citizen. Let me go over it. Oh, this is maybe interesting. So here, the question behind this graph is, if we look, the idea is congruence. It's an old idea in political culture research that goes back to Harry Eckstein. The idea is that the structure of a society, so the regime type that it has, corresponds in meaningful ways with the mentality that is prevalent. There's a structure, culture, congruence. If that is true, I thought we might model regime change. So a gain or a loss in level of democracy. We might be able to model regime change as a function of the misfit, of the incongruence between culture and structure at a given starting point. So what we see here is residuals. It shows how much the institutions of a society were in disaccordance with the values 30 years ago. So if I have a positive residual, look at Venezuela, that means Venezuela 30 years ago was too democratic with respect to where the emancipative values of the Venezuelans were at that point in time. That means they were low, but the country was considered a quite working democracy. And then we look at regime change over the 30 years that follow. And we see, to a large extent, it's not a perfect line, of course, but to a large extent, countries democratized roughly to the extent to which the system before was too autocratic relative to the values that were already there 30 years ago. So indeed, regime change is a function of culture, structure, congruence, or misfit. And this is at least gets us a step closer to thinking in terms of causality. Yeah, I wanted to talk about this as well. Then two important qualifications to the theory. When I saw this the first time, I was a bit surprised. So what we see here, from left to right, the person's level of formal education is increasing. And from top to the bottom, from bottom to top, you see emancipative values being stronger. And now you see these curves are all having an upward slope. And this is kind of a bit surprising, because if you think about on what systems of education differ around the world and across culture zones, they differ in content, they differ in the curricular structure, they differ probably in the quality of the teaching personnel, they differ in the quality of the infrastructure, they differ in all kinds of things you could imagine, and probably they also differ in the types of virtues that a regime tries to instill into people. And there's a couple of culture zones. If you think of the Islamic East, this is MENA region countries, basically. These are not blueprint democracies. These are mostly authoritarian societies. They have no interest in making people emancipatory. Actually, they should do everything not to let that happen. And this is also an old idea in political science, that regimes tend to instill in people the norms that support the regime. So, outside the Western democratic context, you should think that education makes people more autocratic, not more emancipatory. But then you get this. There is a universal, of course there's differences in intercepts, there's differences in slopes, but it's all going upward. That's amazing. I mean, we do not build here, we do not look at madrasa school education. It's all about academic education. So there's something in education that has an enlightenment effect. And that is probably, regardless what discipline, what subject you are studying, what you learn in academic education is to think for yourself. And that's intellectual empowerment. And when you have to learn to think for yourself, you don't want to be remote controlled anymore. And then emancipative values, emancipatory ideals will start to resonate with your mindset. I think that is what is behind here. Now, importantly, why do we nevertheless see differences in intercepts and slopes? That relates to a very interesting phenomenon that I came across when I wrote Freedom Rising, and I thought for a long time about it, and I called it social cross-fertilization, because it's very systematic. The thing is this, it's a multi-level phenomenon. The intercept is higher, and the slope is steeper in this individual level relationship from education to emancipative values, when the characteristic in question, namely education, is more prevalent in the society. So that means a higher prevalence of the same phenomenon at the aggregate level kind of boosts its effect on the individual level. So therefore I talk about a cross-fertilization thing. I also have tried to systematize this by the following graph. You can think of an individual level attribute, let's say emancipative values. You can think of another individual attribute that is a consequence of it. Let's think of protest participation. And we have lots of evidence that people who are more emancipatory participate more in unconventional forms of peaceful protest. And then you would see this. When the element in question, this is emancipative values, would have a low frequency in the society, the intercept would be low and the slope would be flat. If it's stronger, the intercept is higher and the slope is steeper. And when the slope gets steeper, I call this an amplifier effect. When the intercept gets higher, I call this an elevator effect. And a good illustration that this is not only working in concept can be seen here. This is pretty much the same pattern as before, right? It's just different variables. Here we have education again, here we have emancipative values, and here we see societies where education is differently prevalent. Of course, in traditional economies, it's least prevalent. In industrial economies, it's more prevalent, and in knowledge economies, it's most prevalent, and that explains the difference in intercept and slope. This relates to another important insight. Namely, when I look how action resources work on emancipative values, I made a distinction. I was asking myself the question, is it more important that an individual himself, herself, has more resources than the others in her society? So is it that what a person has on top of most other people in the same society that pushes towards emancipative values, or is it the matching part of these resources that most people have in common? And it's very, very clear it's the latter. So it's important that we have a high common shared level of these action resources in a society, and that gives a real push towards these emancipative values. I have a psychological explanation for that, because if people are more alike in terms of possession of basic vital resources, developing solidarity is easier, and then the circle of empathy, the circle of solidarity widens in a society. And this relates us also to a problem that we observe right now. It's not all rosy. I'm not sure if I'm getting into this, but here. That's relating a little bit to our recent problems. This is one component here of the emancipative values. It's the component about sexual liberties, so tolerating homosexuality, gay rights, divorce, abortion. And here we see social classes and this is now only Western countries, because I want to have a take on populism. And why do we observe the rise of nationalism and right-wing populism recently? Because for my research, this was like feeling like a very strong headwind. I got actually tons of emails from people, hey, what you published in the last 25 years, this all didn't happen, because why could these parties be so successful if there's always this emancipatory trend? Well, the trend is there. But now we're going more into this type of analysis. We're dividing up the populations. This is subjective social class. I was very surprised when I looked into these data. They were in the World Value Survey ever since. I've never looked into this variable where people are supposed to indicate what social class they think they belong to, because the reason why I did not do this is because sociologists tell me, since I'm studying, that the concept of social class is dead. You know, but there is less than 2% missing values when people are asked this question. And it's a simple one. So people are supposed to say whether they think they belong to the upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class. There is no middle class, don't ask me why. Lower middle class, working class, and lower class. And I depict these classes here also in terms of how sizable. So this is upper middle class is about a quarter. 20 years ago, it's now a little bit more than a quarter 20 years later. And we see how these have moved over time in this cleavage space. And you see all parts have been moving upward, but at such a different speed that the class polarization very clearly has been increasing. And we do have a phenomenon of something like the left behind. Because the lower, to a lesser extent, the working class, but certainly the people who see themselves in the lower class have lost touch with the mainstream, and we have some clear indications that this is the voter base of the right-wing populist parties. And for a long time, these people would not vote in the first place. Now they do get back into participation, but vote for those parties because the feelings of being left behind have some reality behind them. In fact, there is even more reality to this. So a colleague of mine gave a talk recently. I found this pretty shocking evidence. There is a long line of research in political science looking at how responsive are our modern day democracies to public preferences, and especially to preference change. And people like Stimson, McCune have shown in decades of research with long time series analyses, best evidence always for the US, but also now for other countries, when there is a policy mood change, there will be a public policy change correspondingly. So there is responsiveness. So in some sense, the conclusion always was the democratic institutions do work and fulfill their promise and their job. That picture holds until you make a couple of distinctions. And that is when you look at what are lower class preferences and what are upper class preferences. And as long as they converge, politics follows. In the moment that they diverge, politics goes with the upper class preferences. And here's the shocking news, no matter who governs. So this pattern is also observable under leftist parties. So there is an oligarchic tendency in our modern democratic systems to this extent. And I believe this tendency is stronger or will get stronger when the social polarization gets stronger, because then the class differences just gain so much more salience. And these are the problems we are confronting with right now. And I'm looking no longer so much onto country averages. I'm now breaking those up into smaller group comparisons and see what's going on in different parts of the electorate. Nevertheless, I tend to be a very positive, optimistic person, and I'm just, Steven Pinker sent me a pre-pub version of his forthcoming Enlightenment Now, which I recommend everyone to read. It's a sequel of The Better Angels, and it's just great writing. So I guess I leave a little bit room for Q&A, and I'm really curious about your ideas and criticisms that you will have for sure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for this absolutely great talk. So we indeed have quite some time for questions. So,
regarding this latest statement that you said about the divergence of the upper and lower class, so if this is the trend, is there something that could and should be done at this moment in order to reverse it? Or is it inevitable that we're witnessing, or what would be your conclusions for that, or perhaps suggestions to the public that is here?
Well, that's of course the $65,000 question, but I have my personal answer to this. So what can one do against this polarization trend? Is it inevitable? There is not many topics where I have disagreements with my good old friend Ron, but here I have. In his new book about moral evolution, he argues that the transition in the knowledge society brings inevitably this greater social inequality, and I don't believe this is true. And what made me believe that this is not true is reading Thomas Piketty's History of Capital. And many of us don't know. I knew a lot about the New Deal, but I didn't know that the United States under FDR was a vanguard in progressive income taxation and progressive real estate taxation. And what he is saying, we have to get back to progressive taxation and its redistributional effects. In the United States, they had an 80% on the highest income bracket and 90% on the largest real estate. So Hearst Castle wouldn't go from one generation to the next. And we have, of course, to do this on a global basis because countries have to coordinate that. So that, I think, is what would be my short answer to that question.
Do you see a difference between what I would call accidental emancipation and formative emancipation? By accidental emancipation, I mean it just happens without, in a sort of discursive sort of way. Formative means it's got some sort of planning process about it and value system.
That's I actually haven't thought about that. So these distinctions are not very prominent in my mind. Maybe because I believe that the process that makes these values rise is not a planned process. If one could accelerate it because one knows the mechanisms, I believe one could do so. I could think of how to create a civic education program so that it enhances the effect, but I don't think that you can create a program that is out of touch with people's real life experiences and then instill those values just because you think they are advantageous. That would be my take on that.
It'd be interesting to see whether or not that we could avoid some of the disruptions that occur from what I would call accidental emancipation, as for example in the Arab Spring experiment.
Oh, that's interesting point. When the Western media were branding the Arab Spring, in the beginning at least, as a democracy movement, I said, this is not a democracy movement. Emancipative values are very weak in these societies, for which reasons I had strong reasons to think that democracy is not the top priority of these demonstrations and protests. It was outright frustration about government failure and exchanging those in power, but not necessarily exchanging the power structure.
Chris, perhaps of interest to this audience is your struggle with your political science colleagues and the question of how you have come to psychology, you might say, or come to an appreciation of the importance of subjective elements in the discovery about how things work politically.
Yeah, I'm pointing to this repeatedly, maybe too often, but indeed, in the meanwhile, I publish more in sociology and psychology journals than in political science journals. There was outright frustration sometimes. In psychology, I find much audiences that are more attuned to that. So I believe political scientists like to think in terms of, or let me put it like this, you enhance your value of counseling and advice in political science when you are in institutional design. So if you are someone who can explain, okay, if electoral rules are like this, then you will have a party system like that, and then you have advisory value. And that goes over knowledge about institutional design. And they don't like broader social forces, thinking in terms of mentalities. And I think it's a pitfall. Also, economists, I would criticize them too. So there is at least two disciplines who make very strong causal arguments that always involve assumptions about human motivations. Historians do this also all the time. When someone explains why Bismarck did this or that, no one has done an interview to that end. This was simply assumed. And the assumptions are sometimes very strong, and they have no knowledge of psychological theories. And that, for that matter, I would actually advocating psychologizing the other social sciences.
Thank you very much for this most impressive facts. I'd like to get back to a very basic question regarding the reliability or internal consistency of your emancipatory values index. I guess its consistency varies across countries. And could you tell a little bit more about it? For example, examples on the continuum and other implications of, let's say, less consistent indices of what you were showing to us.
This is a hot topic for me right now, because the one debate I was referring to was in CPS, where I have shown that whether a concept has high or low internal consistency has no bearings whatsoever of its predictive power. And my take on this is that when something has predictive power, it has something to do with reality. And therefore, to argue simply and only on the grounds of internal consistency that a measurement model fails certain statistical criteria, to say that this is not valid, I think is throwing out the baby with the bath water. And we also show that in different countries, sometimes it's this component that it's stronger, sometimes it's the other component that it's stronger. It's like knowing that berry consumption is nutritious. And some people prefer raspberries and others prefer blackberries, and it doesn't matter which one you prefer, as long as you look at berry consumption. And so my take on emancipative values is of a similar logic. I take these four components not as interchangeable, measuring the same thing, but as substitutes for each other. I'm actually working on another paper. I mentioned this yesterday short in this other seminar room with a Russian colleague, Kirill Shirkov, who did all the calculus, and he is one of our geniuses from our labs in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He now shows that the degree of model failure on terms of internal consistency is almost fully explained by lack of item dispersion. What does that say? It tells us that in countries where the population is relatively consensual on several items, either on the upper or the lower end, the correlation matrix does not just show big correlations because there's too little dispersion, and then you cannot produce a satisfactory model. But the conclusion is not this is because there is different meanings, but this is simply the artifact of a mathematical law.
I like your second answer to the question about reliability or internal consistency with differences among countries having to do with some variables not being variables in some countries. The metaphor of raspberries and blackberries is more concerning to me for this group, because it assumes we know what a blackberry is, we know what a raspberry is. When we're asking questions of people, we're not sure that we know what we're asking them. So there's something to that. For example, I do use the same metaphor that you do, but I'd encourage the audience, and curious whether you'd agree, to try to work on measures that have internal consistency, and to think very carefully if you're trying to compare measures in different countries that have very different alpha coefficients and such. What do you think? Do you have further comment on that, or let it go?
Well, I apologize for the intellectual lapses. Yes, one should be a little bit, I'm polarizing this right now in a certain direction, of course. I would get concerned when I summarize things that are negatively correlated with each other, because then they cancel each other out, so that you should probably not do. It's a little bit depending, I have a box in my book where I try to probe into these different logics of what is a formative measure and what is a reflective measure and what are the different logics. For me, for instance, when you have a certain theoretical definition, and if you have non-perfect alphas, non-perfect correlations, what it simply shows me is that there are complementary variance proportions among the components. But if you think of the components being complementary under the roof of a theoretical definition, I would still have no stomach issues in summarizing those as long as they have predictive power. I would apply one additional criterion. When you do a sum of whatever summary measure you produce, the summary should be better than its components looked at separately. Otherwise, there is no added value in producing the summary in the first place. But I think we won't resolve that debate today because it's probably continuing still for a while.
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you again so much for this absolutely brilliant talk. Thank you.
Thanks.